I used to believe I would never escape the shadow of my childhood. The night someone I trusted shattered everything I thought was safe. How many of us walk through life carrying wounds no one can see? How many of us wake up exhausted, anxious, and still wonder why trusting anyone feels impossible, even when life looks normal on the outside? My name is Emily Carter. I'm 35 years old, living in Seattle with my husband and our 5-year-old daughter. I'm a graphic designer. I spend my days creating visuals that tell stories, but for years I couldn't find the courage to tell my own. When I was 9, my parents left me home alone for a few hours so they could pick up an extra night shift at the factory. Money was always tight, and we lived in a small town in Pennsylvania where neighbors waved every morning and everything looked safe. That night, my older cousin, someone my parents trusted, stopped by. I remember the sound of his boots thudding on the kitchen floor, the smell of cigarette smoke clinging to his jacket, and the flickering yellow light above the sink. When he grabbed me, my body locked up. My throat closed. My heart pounded so loud, I thought the whole neighborhood would hear it. The pain was sharp, ripping. I stared at the magnets on the fridge, silently begging to disappear. When it was over, he walked out like nothing had happened. And then came the silence, the crushing silence of that empty house. I curled up on my bed, biting down on my blanket to muffle my sobs. By morning, I had learned my first survival skill, how to smile and pretend everything was fine. That's how I became the good kid, the quiet one, the straight A student, the polite girl who never caused trouble. Inside, I felt dirty, broken, convinced there was something deeply wrong with me. Years went by. I built a career, got married, had a child. On the outside, I looked like I had everything together. But trauma doesn't stay in your childhood bedroom. It followed me into every meeting, every project, every late night deadline. At work, I'd freeze when a male coworker leaned too close. A Slack notification could send my heart racing like I was back in that kitchen. Deadlines felt like life or death situations. I'd sit at my desk, hands trembling, staring at a blank screen, terrified someone would see through me. Even becoming a mom ripped open wounds I thought I'd buried. I'd hold my daughter at night, watch her tiny fingers curl around mine, and cry silently because she was the age I once was, small, helpless, praying for safety that never came. For years, I thought strength meant hiding it all, smiling through the pain, being high functioning. But the truth, I was drowning in silence. And this is the story I've never told anyone until now. As I got older, that day in the kitchen didn't just stay buried in my memory, it spread like a poison through every corner of my life. By my teenage years, I wasn't just quiet or shy. I was a girl living in a body that never felt safe. My nervous system was permanently set to high alert, what therapists now call hypervigilance. Even the smallest noise could send me spiraling. At night, I'd lie awake for hours, staring at the shadows on my bedroom wall, my heart pounding like I was still trapped in that house at 9 years old. Sleep became a war zone. Some nights I woke up screaming, convinced someone was in my room. Other nights, I just lay frozen, too scared to move. I didn't have words for PTSD back then. I only knew that I never felt normal. I tried to control what I could: food. I stopped eating for days, then binged until I was sick. I thought if I could make my body disappear, maybe the shame would too. Science now tells us that kids who go through trauma often carry it in their bodies. Cortisol levels, skyrocket hormones, get thrown off balance, and the brain starts wiring itself for survival instead of safety. That was me, a kid growing up with a brain that thought danger was everywhere. At school, I wore perfection like armor. Straight A student council awards, I worked so hard to prove I was okay that no one thought to ask if I wasn't. I smiled at friends but felt like I was trapped behind glass, rehearsing every laugh, terrified that if I let my guard down, someone would see the truth that I was broken. When I moved to New York as an adult, I thought I'd finally escaped. I had built an incredible career in design. I was that girl people envied, polished, confident, successful. But inside, I was running on fumes. Work became my drug of choice. The more exhausted I was, the less I had to feel. My anxiety wasn't just mental. It lived in my body. I'd sit in meetings with my chest so tight I could barely breathe. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., my heart racing like I'd run a marathon, going over every mistake I'd ever made. My doctor said it was stress, handed me a prescription, and sent me home. But science has a name for this complex PTSD. It's not just stress. It's a brain and body rewired by years of fear. Studies show childhood trauma increases your risk of chronic illness, autoimmune diseases, depression, even early death. And my body was proof. Headaches blurred my vision. My gut was in constant pain. My hormones were chaos. I was only in my 30s, but I felt decades older. And still, no one asked the one question I needed to hear: what happened to you? Because we don't ask that in our culture. We hand out pills and call it treatment. But my story had been screaming through my body for decades. I used to think I could just push through it. That's what I'd always done. Work harder, be stronger, pretend I was fine. But my body finally had enough. One night after a brutal 14-hour day at the office, I was riding the subway home. Out of nowhere, my heart started pounding so hard, I thought it was going to burst out of my chest. My vision blurred, my hands went numb, and I was sure I was about to die right there at Union Square. I stumbled off the train, gasping for air, shaking uncontrollably. A stranger called 911. At the ER, they told me it was just a panic attack. Just stress, the doctor said, like it was no big deal. But it was a big deal. It felt like my body was screaming at me, I can't do this anymore. That night, I promised myself I'd stop pretending. I found a therapist. And in that tiny office on the Upper West Side, someone finally looked me in the eye and said, "This isn't just stress. You're living with complex PTSD." I'd heard of PTSD. I thought it was something only war veterans had. But CPTSD, she explained, it's what happens when your nervous system is stuck in survival mode for years, like mine had been since I was 9. My fight, flight, freeze switch had been jammed on for 2 decades. No wonder I couldn't sleep. No wonder my body was falling apart. I remember sitting there with tears streaming down my face, not from shame, but from relief. For so long, I thought I was broken, damaged, weak. But now I finally understood I wasn't crazy. I wasn't weak. I was carrying wounds that had never been allowed to heal. And suddenly, it all clicked why I was guzzling coffee to stay awake, pouring wine at night, to calm down, popping painkillers for migraines, and burying myself in work to avoid feeling that gnawing pain inside. In my desperation for answers, I started binge listening to podcasts and reading everything I could about trauma. That's when I heard Dr. Paul Conti speak in an interview. The way he described trauma changed everything for me. He said it's not weakness or sickness. It's a survival mechanism stuck in overdrive. Then he said a line I'll never forget. Trauma drives pain. Pain fuels suffering. And suffering makes us desperate to soothe ourselves by any means necessary. That sentence felt like a gut punch, because that was me soothing myself in ways that were slowly killing me. And isn't that what's happening everywhere in this country? We live in a culture that tells us no one should ever feel pain. So when life hurts, we're handed pills that promise instant relief. Opioids, some of the most powerful psychoactive drugs on earth, are prescribed like candy. They erase pain in a moment, even the deepest pain. But they also trap us, weaken us, and for far too many, they kill us. Hundreds of thousands of lives lost not because people wanted to die, but because they were just trying to survive the only way they knew how. I've never touched opioids, but I recognize that same desperation in myself. Trauma had rewired my nervous system to scream for comfort, for quick relief. And I finally understood this wasn't about willpower. This was biology. This was survival mode running my life. After that panic attack on the subway and hearing the words "you're living with complex PTSD" from my therapist, something inside me cracked open. For years, I thought I was just weak or broken. But now, I finally had a name for what was happening. It wasn't that I was too sensitive or not strong enough. My body had been stuck in survival mode since I was 9 years old, and it was screaming for help. That realization was terrifying, but it also gave me hope. Because if trauma had rewired my brain, maybe I could rewire it back. That's when my healing journey really began, slow, messy, and full of tears, but the only way forward. The first step was the hardest. I'd carried the secret for over 20 years, burying it so deep I thought I'd take it to my grave. Saying it out loud felt like peeling off my own skin. One night, I sat across from my closest friend in a dimly lit coffee shop in Brooklyn. My hands shook so badly I had to hold my mug with both hands. I whispered what had happened to me at 9 years old, and I'd waited for her to look at me with disgust or pity, or something that would confirm all the shame I'd carried. But she didn't. She reached across the table, held my hand, and said, "None of that was your fault. You were just a kid." I sobbed so hard that night, but for the first time I felt lighter. Shame thrives in silence. Speaking it out loud was like unlocking the first door to my freedom. Talking wasn't enough. My therapist introduced me to EMDR, eye movement desensitization, and reprocessing, a therapy that helps your brain reprocess traumatic memories. At first, I was skeptical. I didn't want to relive those nights, but EMDR didn't make me relive it. It helped me rewrite it. I sat in my therapist's office, following her fingers with my eyes as she guided me back to those frozen moments. I remember one session vividly. I saw myself at 9, terrified and small, and for the first time, I could see that little girl wasn't to blame. She wasn't dirty or broken. She was just a child who needed love and safety. I cried for her like I'd never cried before. Week by week, the nightmares that haunted me for decades started to fade. The memories were still there, but they no longer had the power to paralyze me. Trauma doesn't just live in your mind. It lives in your body. For years, I felt like my body was my enemy. I hated it. I numbed it with alcohol, caffeine, painkillers, overwork, anything to avoid feeling. Somatic therapy changed that. My therapist taught me how to notice small sensations without panicking, like feeling the weight of my feet on the floor or the rise and fall of my breath. It sounds so simple, but for someone whose body had been in constant fight or flight for decades, it was revolutionary. Breathwork became my anchor. Slow, deep breathing signaled to my nervous system that I was safe. It was like telling my body, you're not 9 years old anymore. You're safe now. Little by little, my digestion improved. My migraines became less frequent, and I started sleeping through the night, something I hadn't done in years. Once my body started to calm down, I could finally begin rewiring my mind. I started journaling every morning, not the pretty Instagram kind of journaling, but raw, messy pages full of anger, grief, and shame. It felt like pouring poison out of my system. Meditation helped me sit with emotions instead of running from them. I remember my first silent retreat. It was brutal. My thoughts screamed at me for days. But by the end, I felt a sense of peace I didn't know was possible. Joining a trauma support group was a turning point. Sitting in a circle with strangers who carried similar pain, I realized I'm not alone. I'm not crazy. I'm not broken. That validation changed everything. Healing hasn't made me forget what happened, but it has given me back my life. I sleep through most nights now. No more waking up drenched in sweat from nightmares. My panic attacks are rare, and when they come, I know how to ground myself. I'm more present with my daughter instead of parenting through fear. At work, I'm no longer chasing success to prove my worth. I can say no, set boundaries, and create from a place of calm instead of burnout. Healing didn't erase the scars, but it gave me back my power. The 9-year-old girl who felt trapped and voiceless finally feels safe inside me. Going through therapy, I started to realize this wasn't just my story. What happened to me wasn't an isolated nightmare. It was a thread in a much bigger, darker pattern, one that was woven long before I even got here. I remember listening to Dr. Paul Conti on a podcast one night while I was washing dishes, and something he said just froze me. Trauma doesn't just live in your mind. It rewires your brain, messes with your hormones, and can even switch your genes on or off. That's why trauma doesn't stop with you. It echoes through generations. That hit me like a punch to the chest. Suddenly, everything started making sense. The panic attacks, the exhaustion, the way I was always on edge. This wasn't just stress. My brain had been locked in survival mode since I was 9 years old. My amygdala, the fear center in my brain, was like a smoke alarm blaring 24/7. Cortisol was constantly flooding my body, aging me faster than the calendar ever could. And here's what terrified me most. These changes don't just stay in me. They get passed down. I read a study that still haunts me. Children of Holocaust survivors were found to carry the biological fingerprints of their parents' trauma, higher cortisol levels, altered gene expression, and a nervous system wired for danger, even if they grew up in safe homes. And I saw that playing out in real life, in my own daughter. She's 6 now, but even as a toddler, I noticed she startled at loud noises more than other kids. She'd cling to me in crowded places, her little body tense, her breath quick and shallow. By preschool, her teacher said she seemed anxious and sensitive. At first, I thought I was just overprotective. But in therapy, I realized she wasn't just copying my behavior, she was absorbing my nervous system. Babies literally sync with their parents' emotional states. My constant hypervigilance was teaching her body that the world wasn't safe. One night after a brutal 12-hour day at work, I came home exhausted, and she looked up at me and said, "Mommy, are you mad at me?" I swear my heart cracked in half. She could feel my stress so deeply that she thought she was the cause. I hugged her so tight and tried not to cry. In that moment, I knew I couldn't let this cycle continue. I thought about my mom, too. She grew up in chaos, carrying wounds she never talked about. My dad's anger was his armor, hiding his own pain. And here I was, successful on paper, falling apart on the inside, living proof of what happens when pain goes unhealed. That night, I leaned over my daughter's bed, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "It stops here. The cycle ends with me." That became my mantra. Every therapy session, every boundary I set, every deep breath I took instead of snapping at her, it was all part of rewriting the script. Not just for me, but for her. Because healing isn't just about us, it's a gift we give our kids. And here's what I've learned. Trauma thrives in silence, but healing begins in connection. Joining a support group was life-changing. Sitting in a circle of women who had been through their own hell made me feel seen for the first time in my life. It reminded me I'm not broken, I'm human. Healing is rebellion. It's standing up to generations of pain and saying, no, this stops with me. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this. You're not broken. Your mind and body aren't betraying you. They've been working overtime to protect you. Every panic attack, every sleepless night, every time you felt too much or not enough. That's your nervous system trying to keep you alive. You are not weak. You are not crazy. You are human. And humans deserve healing. I know how scary it is to tell your story, to say out loud what you've been carrying for years. But healing begins in connection. You don't have to do this alone. Talk to someone you trust. Join a support group. Look into tools like EMDR, somatic therapy, IFS. Read books about trauma. Start where you are. And if this story resonated with you, I'd love for you to share it. Maybe there's someone out there tonight scrolling on their phone, feeling broken and alone, who needs to hear that there's hope. That's why I started The Truth MD, to create a space where we can talk about the things that hurt us most and learn how to heal together. So if you're ready to be part of that conversation, subscribe, share this video, leave a comment. Your voice matters more than you know. I'll leave you with this image, me sitting on the front porch of my apartment in Brooklyn, a cup of tea in my hand, breathing in the cool night air. My daughter's laughter echoes inside the house. My heart is calm. There's a peace in my body I never thought I'd feel again. 10 years ago, I couldn't imagine this moment. Now it's my reality. You don't have to walk this road alone. I believe in your healing because if I can do it, so can you.